Chapter 5. They scaled the riverbank and moved into a grove of towering oak trees. The tree trunks rose like giant black candles from the forest floor and vanished into a dense foliage overhead. The open woods made easy walking, but it also left them exposed. Amos knew that even if they should see an Indian before he saw them, it wouldn't make much difference. There was no place to hide. "Slow down, Amos," Clara called. He stopped and waited for her and Jonathan. "We need to get as far away from here as we can before dark," he told her. "They've never been able to track us through these trees," Clara said. She pointed back along the ground she had just covered. "You can't even see where we've walked." "I can't, but I bet an Indian could," Amos said. "I'm hungry," Jonathan said, sagging to the ground. Amos thought of the jerky they had had the night before. The few meager strips had barely dulled their hunger. There was plenty of animal signs in the woods and sounds of them fleeing the human intruders, but there was no way to catch any of them. Squirrels scolded them from above with mocking chatter. "We're lucky to have Queen Anne's milk," Amos thought, "but what we need is meat." As if reading his thoughts, Clara spoke up. "We've got to get something solid to eat, Amos. We can't walk if we don't have the strength. I wish I had a cooking pot. I saw some nettles back there by—" "I don't want any nettles," Jonathan announced. "They taste like spinach." "When you get honest to Jacob hungry," Clara said, "you'll eat anything." "I'm already honest to Jacob hungry," Jonathan replied, "but I don't like spinach." Amos didn't bother to point out that even if they had a cooking pot, they didn't have any fire. "Maybe we'll come across a walnut tree," he said, "or hickory. Papa says there were plenty of nut trees out here in the woods." He should have been looking, he thought, because every hour that passed they got hungrier and weaker. He recalled the hot skillet bread they had had for supper on Wheeling Island, and the memory of it made his mouth water. It could be a long time before they tasted bread again. "There was no use sitting here talking about food when we don't have any," Clara said. Assuming command again, she walked off with Queen Anne. Amos was content to let her lead, but he kept himself alert for any visible signs of humans or sounds that might signal danger. The woods were as dim and as cool and as quiet as a cellar. They had walked for some time when Amos noticed that the forest seemed brighter. Maybe they were coming to another clearing. Ahead, thin shafts of sunlight reached the ground, allowing bushes and seedling trees to thrive. He heard Clara's loud sigh, and when he stopped beside her, he expelled his breath too. A good-sized creek lay across their path. Its banks fell at least 20 feet straight down, bare and slick with mud. The creek was a tributary of the Ohio River, but Amos knew it was much more than that. It was an impassable rift that lay between them and Marietta. "We can't get across that," Jonathan said. "The banks are too steep," Amos agreed. "We could slide down into the water, but we'd never get up the other side." "Even if we could, Queen Anne couldn't," Clara said. The Jersey, oblivious to their predicament, chomped at the tender grass along the bank. Finally, Clara spoke. "We'll just have to go along this side of the creek until we find a spot to cross. We'll be leaving the Ohio, but the stream will always lead us back to it. There's nothing else." "I'm tired of walking," Jonathan mumbled and dropped down to the ground. "Get up, Jonathan," Clara ordered. "We're going to keep walking until we get to Marietta, no matter how far it is." She prodded him to his feet. "I know you're hungry, we all are, but we have to keep—" "All right, sister. But what will we do when we can't walk anymore? Crawl?" Clara grinned and slapped his shoulder. "I'll crawl and you can ride on my back," she said. Coaxing the reluctant cow from her grazing, they started upstream. Food was never far from Amos's thoughts now. His whole body cried out for nourishment. Each step seemed to require more and more effort, and sometimes he stumbled in the wet leaves. This detour was making them use up what little strength they had left. "I'd give anything for a bite of meat," he thought, licking his lips. Though the creek gradually narrowed, the bank remained hopelessly steep. Once Amos spied a chestnut tree on the opposite bank and was angry that he couldn't get to it. He'd have to be sure to watch for it when they went back downstream. Just then, Clara exclaimed and dropped to the ground. Where sunlight warmed the creek bank, wild strawberries had taken root and now yielded fruit. They crawled around on their hands and knees to find every precious berry, even gulping down some that were still green. The berries, along with their brief stop, refreshed them and gave them the will to continue. Amos was leading the way when he looked down into the creek bed and saw the riffle. A shoal of sand and small stones clogged the stream bed and channeled the water to one side, where it flowed only inches deep. It was what they had been looking for, a place with low banks and shallow water. As Amos scrambled down to the riffle, he watched a silvery fish flash from the shallows into the deep water. If only they had a hook and line. "Do you have any fish hooks in your knapsack?" he asked Clara as she led Queen Anne down the bank. No, they were in the chest on the boat. "There ought to be some way to catch a fish," Amos said. "Could you eat it raw?" Clara asked, wrinkling her nose. "No, I forgot," Amos mumbled, feeling his hope, like the creek's quiet flow, ebbing away. Maybe the time would come when he got hungry enough to eat raw fish, but that wasn't yet. The easy crossing lifted their spirits, and they headed back toward the Ohio at a livelier pace. Amos had forgotten the Indians in his eager search for food. He had to find that chestnut tree. His eyes on the overhead branches, he yelped when his bare foot came down on a chestnut burr. The ground was covered with them, prickly brown pods opened by last fall's prying frosts. He heard a barking sound over his head and located the squirrel by its angry snapping tail. He pointed to the few chestnuts still clinging intact to the branches. Somehow they had escaped the winter and the greedy squirrels. "I'll climb up and get them," Jonathan said, not waiting for anyone's consent. Amos watched his brother clamber up the trunk and out onto a sturdy limb, whistling as he went. He was as sure-footed as the squirrel, Amos thought, and almost as noisy. Jonathan dropped nuts from above while Clara and Amos set to work pounding apart the bristled pods between stones, then cracking open the thin inner shells. Half-moon kernels as big as the end of a man's thumb came out in one piece. On the ground again, Jonathan tossed a nut into his mouth. "Finally, we've got something to chew." "You better go easy," Amos warned him, "or you'll end up with a complaining stomach." "I'm saving some of these for later," Clara said, dropping a handful of uncracked nuts into her knapsack. Amos stuffed a few into his pockets. "I wish we had a fire. They'd be much better roasted," he said. "They're good anyway," Jonathan said around a mouthful. "Are you sure you got them all?" Amos asked, tossing a spiny casing at his brother. When it stuck in Jonathan's hair, he pulled it out and threw it back at Amos. Soon chestnut burrs were flying through the air as thick as a swarm of bees. Jonathan yelped when a well-aimed burr hit him right in the nose. "Sassafras," Clara hissed. "You'll have the whole Indian nation down on us. Come on, Queen Anne. You and I are going to Marietta. These knot-headed boys can just stay here and fuss until the Indians find them." She stalked away, still grumbling, while the cow kept turning her head to look at the rowdy boys they were leaving behind. In only moments, Amos and Jonathan had caught up. By the time they had reached the spot where the stream emptied into the Ohio, dusk had descended. The river, fast losing light, shone like molten lead. Choosing a clear, mossy spot under an oak tree for their night camp, Amos and Jonathan sprawled out on the ground while Clara milked the cow. Warm milk and the few saved nuts served as their supper. "How far do you think we've come?" Amos asked Clara. In the dark, he could barely see her face. "Only 3 or 4 miles downriver, I guess," Clara replied. "This walk to Marietta is going to take a lot longer than I thought, with the creek in our way and—" "We should just stay here by the river," Jonathan said. "Papa can find us." "We've got to keep going as long as—" Clara's voice trailed off and she glanced at Amos and then away. "As long as we're able to," Amos thought. Even now he could feel his stomach twisting up upon itself. The cow's milk brought only temporary relief, and the nuts were now all gone. If they didn't get something to eat soon, something substantial, there could be a time when they wouldn't have the strength to go on. Sometime during the night, Amos woke and sat up. He wasn't sure what had roused him, maybe a night bird or an animal creeping over the dead leaves. Though it was dark under the trees, a swath of moonlight slashed the surface of the river like a glittering silver sword. Amos lifted his head and inhaled a long breath. Now he knew it had awakened him. Smoke. Carried on the night wind, it was barely noticeable, but there was no mistaking the pungent odor. He made a complete circle, looking for a light or a glow in the sky. The darkness was deep and unbroken. He rose to his feet and took a few steps away from the camp. Fire meant danger, whether natural or man-made. The woods could be burning, and the fire could be coming their way. If it wasn't a forest fire, then the smoke meant other humans were somewhere near. He better walk a ways and investigate before he woke up Clara and Jonathan. No need for them to worry, too. Using his nose as a guide and the moonlit river as a beacon, he set off downstream. An owl hooted in the distance, and a large animal crashed away through the woods to his right. A deer, he guessed from the sound of it. His thoughts slipped back to Pennsylvania, to a night last spring when he and Simon and his cousin Ethan had camped in the woods. They had built a fire to cook the rabbit Ethan had shot. Stretched out by the blazing logs, they had been amazed when a fawn staggered into the firelight. It stood frozen in place, staring at them with gleaming, startled eyes. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. Simon had spoken then, and in memory, Amos could still hear his voice. Animals have feelings too, Simon had said, and Amos and Ethan had nodded their agreement. It was one of those times when everything in the world seemed right. Amos swiped a hand across his eyes, knowing this was not the time to think of Simon. Just then he stumbled over a log and fell forward into a clump of brush, making as much noise as the deer he had flushed earlier. He proceeded with more caution, groping his way. The moon-washed river was a reassuring sight in the darkness, and as long as he kept it in sight, he knew he'd have no trouble finding his way back to camp. The land lifted for a ways, then leveled off. Just in time, he saw the telltale glow below him. He sank to his knees, and his heart seemed to stop beating. The dying fire cast a flickering shadows over a group of Indians.